Yo, na mirbukmak. Magmak. Yo ngorong ngarato watun wa ngawatango. Ngaito gurol yun lumurong dippal. Gurol ngalil wa ngalil. Kawatun ngarato wa ngawatango kalarkia yorungo tualangoy Dr. Curtis Roman.
I said, absolutely, I'll do a welcome to country. And the reason for that is because this conference was a little bit different to me as a Larrakia person. One of the organisers is the Larrakia man, John Rawnsley. One of the MCs for today and yesterday is a Larrakia person, James Parfitt. And so it had a different context for me, and I was more than happy to do it. For those of you from interstate, Larrakia people have always been recognised as the traditional owners of Darwin and will always be recognised as the traditional owners of Darwin. Larrakia people have endured quite a lot, given that their city, their traditional country was made into a city. But one of those things that's happened as a result is, I believe that our identity has become even stronger, and today Larrakia people, despite a whole lot of intrusions in their lives, are lawyers such as John, are medical doctors, are social workers, are academics, are professional sports people, they're leaders in their communities, and Larrakia people have a very unique community within the Aboriginal community. So we are part of the Aboriginal community, but we are also unique in a sense in that we come together as a smaller community where we continue to do things together. And one of those things was me accepting this opportunity to do this Welcome to Country today because Larrakia people asked me to do it. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I hope you all enjoy your time in Darwin. And if there's anything you want to know about Larrakia people, talk to John, James and myself, and we'll be happy to email you information, whatever you want. Thank you all very much, and I hope you enjoy the conference.
Yo, boko goro pandunanga Dr. Curtis Roman. Gololo, tuanja tarok session on the National Indigenous Legal Conference ngor. Indigenous Health Justice Conference 2019 jadwal tunggara International Year of Indigenous Languages ko ngaranya ko nejesta telepuma putsana kaboko goropan na porka College of Law Australian National University munewal sponsoring dual gator morning meeting. Tuan jana ko next ja ngaratugurol yun the Honorable Jenny Blokland muni ngay judge tiyak Supreme Court ko ngay tulap maram dual conference Justice Blokland ja mangay 29 dunggara tial legal ngor nakun ngay tam ngay ka kanjar tial Northern Territory ngor kaya man ngay dual ngatil yakan na jaw ka Commonwealth Legal Aid, anti-government, ka ngatil ngay kanjama magistrate. Watun number 2, Justice Blokland go.
Good. I wasn't sure where I was supposed to go this morning, but now I can feel a bit comfy being up here, I suppose. So good morning, delegates and distinguished guests, and welcome to the court. I acknowledge the Larrakia people, the traditional owners of Darwin, on whose country the court sits, and we meet today for this most significant conference. The Larrakia people continue to welcome people and are making a continuing contribution to the life and culture in Darwin and the rest of the country today. So I thank you for that welcome to country, Dr. Roman, And thank you for that wonderful introduction, Najista. What a beautiful surprise to hear one of the Onomata languages spoken again in this court. Was that Djamurraponu?
Yes.
Okay, I must be getting the ear for it, you see. I know Najista does a lot of training and everything now, but we've had a lot of cases together, a lot of complex trials, and she's just been the most excellent interpreter. And the court has an excellent relationship with the Aboriginal Interpreter Service. The court and the AIS have worked together on many projects in the past, especially the language and law conferences and the development of court protocols for working with interpreters. We worked a great deal with the first director, Colleen Rose's OAM, also for many years on the NAJAR board, and I know that a lot of you know her as well. So I see from the conference program this morning that you have all the excellent presenters around the issues of language and reverse role plays and so forth. Just for those of you who may be visiting the court, especially for the first time, I know you have a jam-packed program, but if you do have the chance, please have a good look at the court's Aboriginal art collection, built up over many years. There's the memorial poles in the foyer are of special significance, intertwined with the story of injustice perpetrated on Dakiya, eventually corrected by the High Court, and eventually leading to a reconciliation ceremony with his descendants and the descendants of the police officer central to the events and a former Chief Justice of the High Court. There's also the mosaic, which can be viewed from the first level, looking down on the ground, and the information is available about the Central Australian artists who created it. But I leave that with you. It's my recommendation. I hope you have the chance to take it up if you're visiting us. It was great to get an email from David Woodruff, who I of course know as the Principal Legal Officer of NAJAR, and I like to claim him on these special occasions as my former student. But he invited me to speak at the conference, and even better, David suggested talking about and acknowledging the contribution of the largely unheralded Aboriginal women, the Aboriginal women staff who have worked in the Aboriginal legal services in the Northern Territory and allied services elsewhere. This is a very meaningful topic for me, as it was around 35 years ago when I was working for NALIS, the previous Aboriginal legal service in the top end. I see one of my colleagues here from that time, Colin McDonald QC, and I think I caught a glimpse of someone even more ancient, former Judge Dave Parsons. But it's not just for old time's sake or war stories that it's worthwhile reflecting on the contribution of Aboriginal staff, but by reflecting on the qualities of those women and the way that they have gone about their tasks, we realise the enormity of their contribution to making the Aboriginal legal services such formidable organisations, protecting the rights of the most vulnerable people in our community. Lawyers come and go. That's what June Dowling told me last week when I popped out to see her about this address. I'll speak a little bit more about June in a moment. It was the staff at NALIS, and I'm sure it's similar in other legal aid offices, that kept the services going, running on an even keel, even at times when funding was at risk or the services were not supported in sufficient ways by the broader community. Many of those staff were the backbone of legal services, and I'm sure that that pattern plays out in many other parts of the country. Thinking about the women I worked with and the women I know who still work at NAJAR and no doubt the other legal services, I think of the specialised knowledge they have of the communities that they work in, the generosity with which that knowledge was and is shared to lawyers who until recently were unlikely to be Indigenous persons themselves, although that, of course, is changing. And I think about also their social networks, the broader kinship knowledge, and actively making social connections that go well beyond just working in town, being very much linked into town and country. I reflect on the resilience shown in the face of racism and sexism, both casual and overt. Their ability of working with people who are often difficult, and to help the lawyers and the courts do the same. As I think we'd all acknowledge, dealing with difficult people can be a big part of working in the law. What stands out is their diplomacy skills, often required when dealing with police, victims of crime, corrections, other government departments, people in authority, including within the Aboriginal community, who may not want the legal service to act for someone. The nuanced knowledge about how things might go down with particular judicial officers is especially valuable advice to new lawyers. A strong sense and knowledge of Aboriginal history and culture, not judgmental but caring and compassionate in ways that promote strength and understanding, and teaching the lawyers all about those things. All of those skills and qualities and their demonstrated commitment is continually shown. But as June Dowling told me, lawyers come and go, she said. You have to train them. So in regard to the lawyers come and go, I do acknowledge the welcome increase of Indigenous lawyers in the Northern Territory, and I think you'll be hearing a lot more about that today, including from Justice Riley, James Parfitt-Fijo and Ben Grimes. So for a long time there were no or very few Indigenous lawyers in the NT, so the connections between lawyers and the Aboriginal community were thin. So for the staff who worked in the legal services, they did have to teach us, as well as doing their own work. I also acknowledge, of course, that there are women leaders who are or have been the CEOs of the major Aboriginal legal services who either have or will be addressing you at this conference, thinking especially of Dr. Pat Miller AO, who's here, our Northern Territory Deputy Administrator, who herself in an earlier life was a paralegal at Carlis and then the Director of Carlis from the 1980s. And of course the amazing and formidable Priscilla Collins, the CEO of the mighty ship Naja, who is also addressing you at this conference. But for this morning, back to the staff. The first person I will speak to you about is Magdalena McIntosh, known to the world as Maddie. Maddie worked for NALIS as a field officer for 16 years. Not that Maddie would necessarily claim this herself, but Ron Roberts and Maddie are widely credited by others as starting the Aboriginal legal service in the top end. Perhaps it was her personal history that contributed to her being such an impressive and fearless operator. She could deal with all sorts of difficult situations. Her mother was Kanarakan, her father was Dutch. The Edwin Verburg Bridge at Adelaide River is named after him. She was brought up during the Stolen Generation removal period when the Chief Protector was the legal guardian of every Aboriginal and half-caste, as the Act said, child. Although not taken herself, her parents went to great lengths to protect her and her sister from being taken. She's the first person who ever spoke to me about this in the early 80s. Remember, you have to train the lawyers. Her parents divorced, a device her parents used to reduce the risk of them being taken, and the girls were sent to boarding school in St Joseph's in Darwin and later to Charters Towers. They experienced racism and cruelty. Usually they were the only coloured kids, as Maddie puts it, at those schools in those days. She still excelled at school, including being a champion swimmer. To avoid being taken, the girls were taught how to hide from the patrol officers. During the bombing of Darwin, yes, the bombing of Darwin, Maddie is now 84, To evacuate the family, her father drove them and they joined a US Army convoy he had access to on account of his previous work for the American Army, and they drove to Longreach. There's not time to tell the full story, but with that childhood, it's no wonder Maddie had the skills to do what she did for all those years at Nalas. Visiting her last week and talking to her and her granddaughter Zonda, who also worked at Nalas in the early years, she told me that given everything she went through as a younger person, she never had any fear of police or anyone in authority. She was never afraid, even as a young person, although when she was young, she said she recognised fear in other women, especially around child removals and around violence. She saw fear. When she worked at Nalas for that 16 years, she told me that the staff were like family. They all played sport together, and that's the way they bonded, Aussie rules and soccer. She loved going to Groot Island, that was her favourite bush court, and working with the late Connie Bush, another Aboriginal woman legend. She found some of the other communities where the court sat pretty sexist, she told me, but she loved going to Groot. We sometimes did the Groot circuit together, bunking in together at Anuragu. Car stolen and smashed, never allowed to have one again, oh well. Every time we'd get in the plane and be given the back seats, blacks in the back, Maddie would say, with a laugh. I was actually horrified, but she was aware of the social context in those days. She said her big thing was follow up with clients. As we know, that happens more formally now through such great programs like the Through Care, but before the formal processes, that was Maddie's priority. Now we all want bail hostels and alternative placements to detention or imprisonment, but back then Maddie would often have kids stay at the family home and sometimes adults to stay as well, including someone once on a murder charge who'd come in from a community. She reminded me of that last week. She'd just check in and would have them asked, "Are you going to hurt us?" "No." "All right, you can stay then." So they did in the family home. In the early years, often police would not give you the précis or the facts in the magistrate's court. It could make it pretty hard to deal with them and settle cases. Now there's an area of great improvement when you think there hasn't been any. Sometimes Maddie would meet with the police the night before and then let me know what she'd managed to settle. I was in awe of her negotiating skills. It was a lesson that court, and especially bush court, is a complex set of social arrangements. It's not just the law and social procedures. I mentioned June Dowling. I was fortunate to catch up briefly with June last week. Such was the strength of her personality and know-how. I always thought she was the office manager at Nalas when I started working there. No, she corrected me. She was the courier back then, circa 1981. Then later a welfare position, then a field officer, which she absolutely loved. She excelled in all of those roles. June worked for Nalas for 17 years all up. She's 75 now. June and Maddie often worked together. June's big thing was her insistence about going to communities a good 2 or 3 days before the court date, sitting down, talking to people, going to their homes, really getting the feel for the social context of clients and their community. June was originally from Santa Teresa in Central Australia and is still connected with family up and down the Stuart Highway and beyond. Like Maddie, June also remembers the family atmosphere between staff and the lawyers, saying the lawyers were great. If they were good, she would tell them. If they were bad, she'd tell them as well. Like Maddie, June would have clients stay with her if needed. There are still people that come in from community and stay at her and her husband's house in Wanguri. June remembers having to do some pleas herself when the court sat at Yirrkala and the lawyer missed the plane to Gove. June loved being the first point of contact with the clients, and everyone knew that she was the first point of contact. But on that occasion, she was asked by the magistrate if she'd taken instructions because there was no lawyer. It took a lot for her to get up in court, but as she told me, everyone got off that day. It was one day of work that she is really proud of. Now, I'm not to be taken as recommending that practice. June worked on some of the saddest and most difficult cases, including the Dennis Rostron trial that involved multiple counts of homicide, the homicide of a whole family. She worked intensively with Dyson Hall-Lacey and Susan Cox. Dennis Rostron, June said, could not speak a word of English. Back then, there was not an interpreter service, and both Maddie and June regard the interpreter service as a major improvement in the justice system since their time. Neither of them had significant language skills, although some Aboriginal staff did and do. June also worked with David Ross and Susan Cox on a major inquest on Elcho Island, a fatal police shooting of a young man from Gallowinku. I asked June whether being involved in these big, difficult and tragic cases affected her. She said no, because although it was hard, she just felt she had a job to do. It never got her down. She said she felt a certain kinship with her clients. She thinks it did harden her. Anyway, she added, Dennis Rostron for a while was on the lawn mowing gang from the correctional centre, and she used to see him because he comes out and mows the pensioners' lawns, of which she's been one for a number of years, and that's how she's kept up with some of her former clients. June intervened in court at Wadair herself to explain to a magistrate and to the then Nalis's own lawyer that a woman who was a prosecution witness was not being rude or evasive, turning away when being cross-examined. June is proud that she was able to point this out when those sorts of cultural nuances, which were not well recognised at the time, that she was able to tell the magistrate and the lawyer about that. She took great pride in taking instructions, even having them read out in total to the Supreme Court, on one occasion by Dr. Alan Bartholomew, the Melbourne-based forensic psychiatrist. Such was the depth of her communication skills. He just read out the history as taken by June. So after her 17 years at Nalis, June worked at the Sobering Up Shelter and then spent 10 years as an official prison visitor. June's very proud that her granddaughter now works for NAJA and is studying law. I cannot help but wonder if June had had that opportunity, what she would have achieved as a lawyer. We will never know. I have told the NAJA lawyers this before, but with everything going on back in the day, 6 lawyers, we still all did have a lot of fun, and especially with the staff. There were 2 nightclubs in Darwin at the time, Dick's and Fanny's. Nalis, we were Dick's people, with Maddie leading the charge to dance, drink and forget our worries, and June was very much your sober Bob. Now I'm going to mention briefly Maxine Carlton. I fully appreciate there are many other Aboriginal women who've worked in the legal services, and I wish I could highlight all of them. But I would like to mention Maxine from NAJA in Alice Springs, formerly Carlos, where she commenced working as a client services officer in 2003 on a 6-month contract. It's amazing how it gets to people, isn't it? When word got around that this address this morning would honour the contribution of women who worked in the Aboriginal legal services, some of the Alice Springs lawyers really wanted to contribute. Carly Ingalls, currently of the Legal Aid Commission, formerly of Carlos, especially wanted to pass on some information about Maxine after she'd spoken to her, and I thank Carly and Maxine for the information I'm about to give you. I've not worked directly with Maxine, but I am aware of her work through working on both courts and being in Central Australia quite a bit. Once again, it's no wonder Maxine is so effective dealing with people involved in the justice system, given her personal history. She was born in Wyndham. Her mother had her too young, she says, so she was raised by her grandparents. Her grandparents worked at Carlton Hill Cattle Station. Her grandmother a cook, her grandfather a stockman who was originally from the Territory. In the off-seasons, they lived a bush life, camped and followed seasonal tucker. Maxine attended the school that was at that time Lombardina Mission. She was good at school, but remembers the nuns were harsh. She did not meet her father until she was 11. She did not meet her mother until she was 15. She used to travel between Kununurra, Bulla and Port Keats over grandparents' country. She was reunited with her mother and they went to Catherine and Largermanu together. In Largermanu, she was adopted by Old Man Tasman and his wife, as Old Man Tasman thought Maxine's mother drank too much. So began Maxine's life as a Warlpiri woman, she tells it, when she was 15. Maxine explains, the old man adopted me and I adopted his language. Along with everything else she does, Maxine is a Warlpiri interpreter. She said when she lived at Largermanu, Aboriginal law was very strong. She followed the old man's customs. Through him, she is recognised in the Western Desert regions like Kintore and Haas Bluff. Through her biological father, she's recognised as a traditional owner near Timber Creek, and she's recently travelled there to meet family for the first time. Maxine obtained bookkeeping qualifications and skills through the Bachelor Institute and worked in shops and schools, including in New Zealand and at the Largermanu Community Government Council. She coordinated the former CDEP program when it had over 300 participants. Rosalie Cunoth Monks approached her to work for the Aboriginal Interpreter Service, acknowledging that she's here today, where she interpreted Warlpiri. She says Ms Cunoth Monks interprets in 4 different languages and Christabel Swan 5 languages. It's a bit getting close to you, Magister. Asked why she's worked for the service in Alice Springs for so long, she says it's the injustice that keeps her there. She's now the Senior Client Services Officer. She feels responsible for the language and cultural side of things. She says every time she explains something about whitefella law to an Aboriginal person in Warlpiri and she knows they understand, she feels great. She's the only client service officer who lives in a town camp, and she's been president of Charles Creek Town Camp for 3 years. She talks about previous lawyers being really hungry for knowledge about Aboriginal culture. She feels the pressures of funding, the increased lists, and she says without an increase of lawyers. She feels this creates a situation where whitefella lawyers don't have the time or energy to be seeking in-depth knowledge about culture. In 2011, Maxine was the runner-up in the National and Torres Strait Islander Trevor Christian Memorial Award for services to the legal and justice sector. Dr. Pat Miller and Steve Miller were both at Carlos at that time and nominated her for that. She's very proud of that. She's also twice been the president of Tunganjira Council. No small feat given its responsibility for service delivery in so many areas in Alice Springs. She does recall that once out bush, in a case where the client was charged with stealing and killing a bullock, the lawyer told her he couldn't appear for religious reasons. She'd never come across issues of that diversity amongst the lawyers group, as she says it before. She was also headed out to Papunya and Yuendamu circuit with 2 new lawyers. One hit a roo and she screamed at the one driving to pull over so she could cut off the tail. But she was defeated in her attempt to retrieve the tail when all she could find was a butter knife in the Carlos car. She thinks the justice system could be improved by more time and more meaningful discussions with clients. She says everything is too quick for the lawyers and the courts to get a proper understanding. She'd like to see conferencing in domestic violence cases, given the reality that many women daily try to tell her they want the charges dropped and inevitably they'll go back to the perpetrator. She thinks wraparound services to treat alcoholism and DV would improve things. When she hears comments about judges, she says she always feels like she's the person in the middle. Before I leave Central Australia, I want to mention one more thing about Dr. Pat Miller. Richard Coates, one of her former principal legal officers at Carlos, told me about Pat as CEO. He said being the CEO of any Aboriginal organisation in Alice at that time in the 1980s was considered a courageous career move and transitory in nature. Those that survived needed political and diplomatic skills. He said Pat had these in spades and was respected and loved by the lawyers and the Aboriginal staff. She was a great source of wisdom and guidance on cultural issues. However, her unquestioning belief in magic was an eye-opener for the then scientific socialist lawyer Coates. She looked like a suburban mum, Alice Springs style and most respectfully, yet she had all these tales of the magic events that she and the Aranda family had experienced. One of their clients was behaving strangely at the prison and they were trying to get the psychiatrist to see him. Pat told Richard, "I think we should get Freddie Fly, the Nankari, out there too, because someone's probably put a spell on the client." So she rang up the prison superintendent, Tony Bonner, and arranged for the Aranda medicine man to visit the client. The psychiatrist, who turned out to be a Jewish psychoanalyst on sabbatical from LA, diagnosed some sort of psychosis, and no one's really sure what Freddie Fly made of that. Richard just concludes and passes on that it is important, even if you don't believe in magic, working in the Aboriginal legal services, you have to realise that many of the clients do, and unless you're from the community, you need the advice. And that's been the point of emphasising the women giving that advice today. I know it really helped me working with the Aboriginal women staff. We still do need that advice. It was a privilege to work at NALIS with people like Maddie and June. I'm sure all the lawyers who have worked for the legal services have had similar experiences, but I would encourage you all to take a refreshed view of the staff in the legal services, take their advice and take it on board. From time to time, specialised legal services are queried and there's talk of mainstreaming, but clearly the contribution of Indigenous staff for the benefit of clients, lawyers and the courts needs to be fully recognised, as it is what they know and do that is so precious and demonstrates why specialised services are so important. I've only given you a very brief overview of some of the women who have worked at the Aboriginal legal services, but in the face of racism and sexism that they have faced, their ability to continue to give advice and go on is an inspiration that all of us can draw upon. The lifelong friendships that have rewarded me is why we do this often difficult and stressful work. I certainly know I would not be the person I am without those relationships. Knowing people like Maddie, Pat, June and Maxine has enriched my life and experience. When I face difficulties in court, I'm able to draw on the experiences they gave me, and for that I remain absolutely grateful to them. I remain convinced that Aboriginal legal services wouldn't be what they are without the women who work for them. Thank you, and I trust the rest of the conference goes well. Thanks for listening.